All right, Druid cards. I think that Druid did not lose that much with the rotation of a lot of stuff. I think that most of the value that Druid has lost kind of over time came from the nerfs to Druid itself, which was a while back. Um, I think kind of interestingly, Druid used to be a very late game deck in Arena, or a very late game archetype class in Arena, and it's really shifted a lot more to mid range. I think with this Journey to Ungoro stuff, and I'm not really sure it gets. I'm not really sure it wins out in the long game attrition style matches that have been pretty common with Arena here. So I don't know quite where it is, but I don't think it lost that much with the shift, and as a result, I think it's the cards are reasonably okay, and so it holds its position amongst the other classes going forward. Um, Still, that said, I mean, holding its position might mean that it's only like the sixth best class in Arena. Maybe by some reckonings it's like the fourth best, but I don't think it's really in any serious consideration as like the best class in Arena. It's so far off the mark from that I don't know. This is somewhere in the middle of the pack. In any case, let's go to the cards. One of the features here is that the minions all seem good, the spells all seem bad. The spells are what get the higher offering bonus, so it's kind of frustrating. But the minions are actually pretty decent. Here's one of the bad spells. Earthen Scales, just not good. This is not a good card. +1/+1 to a friendly minion for 1 mana is not really worth it. Gaining armor equal to that minion's attack. It's nice that it happens after the +1/+1, but I don't really care. I mean, the armor is not really going to be that relevant, I think. Like, every little bit matters, I guess, but it's not really what I'm looking to do. This card feels a little bit reminiscent of Ironhide. It's not as bad as Ironhide, but that card is actually kind of playable, but this is like a tier 3 card. This is not something I really want in my deck. Maybe it's even worse in tier 3. I want to pass on this, but I'm going to be offered, like 1.6 of these per draft. That's a little disheartening. Elder Longneck. I actually think this card is good. You do need to have the battle cry go off if you want this card to actually have value. Otherwise, it's just a Magma Rager, which is not a good card. But I don't think it's that hard to get this battle cry off. I don't think this condition is actually that tricky. And when you do adapt, if this becomes a 5/4 for 3 mana, that's really good. If this becomes a 5/1 Divine Shield, that's good. If this becomes a 5/1 Death Rattle Summon 2 1/1s, that's good. There's a lot of adaptations that are really good for this. Even Stealth is perfectly fine. And on some boards, preventing this from being targeted by spells or hero powers is going to be enough. So, I don't know. I like this card. I think this is like top of tier 2. If you have a lot of minions with 5 or more attack, or a lot of ways to kind of make this battlecry work, I think it becomes tier 1, right? But I think it's like just in a vacuum, this card is maybe tier 2-ish, mid to high tier 2. So roughly where I'm going to put it. Evolving Spore is another bad spell. I mean, in a sense, this card could just be better than Bloodlust. You give all your creatures +3 attack. That sounds pretty good, right? But sometimes you're not going to have that. And also, you need to adapt all your minions with the same thing. So first off, one of the adaptations is basically just useless in that I'm probably playing this pre-combat because I want to find Wind Fury or plus attack, right? Or really anything, right? If I'm doing any sort of relevant combat, which means stealth is not good, right? Because I then attack with my minions that I just gave stealth. Yeah, it's pretty bad. So right off the bat, one of the 10 adaptations just seems really bad. Giving all my minions protection from being targeted seems pretty bad. And I think more importantly, there are some adaptations that are really good for small minions, give them like poisonous, stuff like that. There's some adaptations that are really good for big minions, and if you have a board with like a mix, it's hard to really whiff, I guess, but it's hard to like hit either, right? You're not going to get as great a value. So I don't know. This card can have some pretty good relevance if you have a board full of small stuff. I think that's kind of where this card gets its most value, right? The more minions, that means the more small little things you get to do. So you kind of want to ignore some of the adaptations that give you a lot of value for big creatures, right? You're not looking to like taunt up your board, certainly. I don't know. I feel like this, even if you get to that scenario where you have a big board, right? This card whiffs enough with all the adaptations that are bad for those small creatures that you don't really want this as a card. I think I'd rather actually take Soul of the Forest over this. And I'm just, in some of the things, I'm just not going to take this card, hardly ever. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe this card gets to like being Bloodlust or like, Wind Fury your guys often enough, and maybe there's like an aggressive Druid archetype that you can be playing with this. I will wait and see, though. Right now, I think this card is bad to the point of unpickable, get something else. Don't draft this card. Giant Anaconda, this card is also really bad. It's a 7 mana 5/3 that sometimes has upside. And the upside is, I mean, what exactly? I end up summoning the minion that I would have played anyways if I hadn't played Giant Anaconda. I mean, I don't know. I thought Void Caller was a good card for Warlock if you could get there with the demons. This card has about the same stat line but costs 3 more. Yeah, that doesn't seem very good. Is a beast, has the beast synergies, and maybe you pull out some really big thing with this guy occasionally, but I think more often than not, I mean, part of the problem is your opponent, if they're afraid of a big thing, if they don't have some way of removing that big thing, they just don't kill this on their turn. And then when you attack in, right, you have to make the trade, and then your guy comes down and doesn't get to attack, right? So like it's slow. It's really slow, and it's not like it's generating you value, it's generating you tempo. A slow card that generates you tempo is not not actually generating you anything, right? So I think this card is really bad. I don't think you ever really play it. Just not a good card. Avoid this. Living Mana. You know, the problem with this card, honestly, is that your mana crystals, when you recover the mana from them dying, you get empty mana crystals. So this thing has a big overload cost no matter how you play it, basically. Even if you can trade off all your guys the next turn and just do, for 5 mana, like, say, 14 damage divided as you choose, almost. The fact that your mana crystals come back empty is pretty bad. There's also just in this format a lot of ways to deal with 2/2s, even a bunch of 2/2s, right? You play a Primordial Drake, for example, and then suddenly all these guys are dead, and why did you just spend all your mana on... Right, you spent most of a turn playing Living Mana, and then most of your next turn, paying the mana cost, essentially, of Living Mana. Yeah, I don't like this card. I think you avoid it. I think it's not good. I think you avoid it in Constructed, too, because you don't want to get your guys devolved and just lose on the spot. But I can't imagine what really goes that well with this. Maybe you adapt your guys. I don't know. Either way, what's kind of frustrating is you can't do this and the Evolving Spores on the same turn, because it transforms your mana crystal. Right? If you play this, right, it destroys 7 of your mana crystals to play your guys, assuming it's filling your board. You need to have like a guy on your board before you can even do that. Yeah. Either way, just don't draft this card. This card is not terribly good. Probably better than Evolving Spores, but not by much. Shell Shifter. Now this card is good, right? Bad spells, good minions. When you want, it's Ascension Shieldmaster. When you don't want, it's a 5/3 with Stealth. Both are pretty good options. This card is just really good. I mean, it's a card that's better than Ascension Shieldmaster. And if you find Staghelm for whatever reason, suddenly you get Stealth and Taunt, I think. What happens? I think this guy's a 5/5 Stealth Taunt, right? He doesn't become like a 3/3 Stealth Taunt, right? I think he becomes a 5/5 Stealth Taunt. In any case, that's not terribly relevant. The relevant thing is that he's well-costed, and great well-costed minion. Yeah, this is tier 1. This is a card you're going to pick almost all the time that you see it. Tortoyan? I have no idea. Tortolan Forager. Battlecry, add a random minion with 5 or more attack to your hand. Yeah, it's a 2-mana 2/2 with value attached onto it. That's amazing. That's great. I'll take this. Yeah, there's not much else to be said for this. This card is really amazing. Curves out really well with the 3/1 adapt if you have a minion with 5 or more attack in your hand, right? That works out really well. And given that your Battlecry could find that guy and you might have another minion with 5 or more attack in your hand, that's pretty nice. This card is just amazing. All these cards where it's just like an early drop that generates more value are really good. This guy is a pretty good top deck too, right? Because the random minion with 5 or more attack in your hand might cost a bunch of mana. Right, so he's good as an early drop, has relevance late game. That's a hard thing to find. A minion that is good early game, good late game as well. Could curve you out into a lot of stuff. This card's amazing. Pick this up pretty much every time you see it. I'm not sure there's a better Druid common at this point in the game. Tyrantus. This card's pretty mediocre. It's a big guy, a very big guy, and not being able to be targeted by spells or hero powers means that he probably sticks around. The trouble is that there's a lot of poisonous stuff in this set. Either you adapt a creature to be poisonous, or you just have one of the naturally poisonous creatures. Tyrantus quite embarrassingly dies to a stubborn gastropod. That's not really what you want to be doing. And when he costs 10 mana, that means there's basically nothing you can do. Like if you just have an empty board and your opponent has a gastropod, you can't play this guy and do anything. You actually just have to like try and kill his gastropod first, or quite awkwardly, you have to hero power his gastropod twice, and then you play Tyrantus, and you cry in a corner while your opponent gets to play the game, and you are just having this card in your hand. I think just big dumb dudes are not as good. You want a card that does something when it enters the battlefield, that stabilizes you, that does whatever, that generates more cards. And I think this guy, even though it's a slower meta and you're looking for late game, and this guy is late game, he's late game of the sort that's actually a little bit vulnerable to everything else going on in the set with this poisonous thing that's happening, right? He also just, because he doesn't have taunt, frustratingly, sometimes in late games, your opponent will have taunt creatures as well, but you'll have to clear them with Tyrantus before you can do anything, right? And he still gets to hit your face. Tyrantus comes down and your opponent says, okay, time for me to go face, and he still gets there. That's going to be pretty frustrating. So I think this card is like tier 3, pretty mediocre. There's probably like half the legendaries that you can draft are worse than this. Half of them are better than this. And given that you see 3 cards, you're probably as likely to see a card that's better than this, right, with those 3 cards. So I think you pass on this most of the time. Verdant Longneck. I think this card is solid. 5/4 Battlecry Adapt for 5. Yeah, sure. He's a, 5/7 for 5. He's a 6/5 for 5. He's a 5/4 Death Rattle Summon 2 1/1s for 5. He's a 5 mana 5/4 Divine Shield, right? Like, all these options are pretty good. There aren't a lot of them that are bad. And, even if you give this guy Stealth, he's still kind of most of a Stranglethorn Tiger, which isn't that bad of a card. Yeah, not a lot of bad options with the Adapt. Very solid mid-rangey card. And that's, I think, kind of the theme of a lot of this Druid stuff. A lot of solid mid-rangey stuff, right? I'd call this a kind of mid-rangey type card, right? I would call Shell Shifter a good mid-rangey card. Tortallin Forager, kind of a good, value mid-rangey card. Verdant Longneck, good mid-rangey card. They're really pushing Druid towards mid-range, it seems. And so I don't think you're like the slow, plodding late game of yield Druids of past. I think you're more mid-rangey, not necessarily tempo, but just getting solid value and hopefully not losing to the guys who are out attritioning you with elementals, because you can't really take part in that in a big way. But or at least you don't have anything that naturally lends you to it. But decent mid-range class, and we'll see how that shakes out in the meta.